Welcome back to Performance Process. My name is Ronan Mc Laughlin and I will be your host as usual. Today we're talking about creatine. It's one of the most researched supplements in sports nutrition. For decades, it's been a staple for bodybuilders and power athletes with solid scientific evidence showing it boosts strength, power and muscle mass. But endurance sport, the picture has always been different. Study after study has found little to no benefit and sometimes even a downside in the form of unwanted weight gain. Despite all that, creatine is everywhere we look these days. Websites, newspapers, magazines, everywhere, everyone is talking about creatine, and it is well and truly back in the spotlight. It's been talked about not just in gyms, but in endurance circles, cycling included, and even in the broader health world where claims range from improved brain function to actually potentially slowing dementia. It's gone from being a niche strength aid to the supplement everyone seems to be talking about. So today, we're asking, what does the latest science really say about creatine for cyclists and endurance athletes? And are there reasons to consider it beyond performance? To help us navigate that and the evidence around all that, I'm joined once again by Dr. Alan McCubbin, sports dietitian, researcher, and returning guest to the show. Alan, welcome back to Performance Process.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me. And it's an interesting topic. I think a lot to get into and an area where there's a lot of talk at the moment, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember I first tried creatine, actually almost got me arrested, believe it or not, creatine, because I tried it back in 2010 and living in Belgium, I didn't realize it was illegal in France. It wasn't banned for athletes or anything, but it was just illegal in France. And crossing the border, or team bus got stopped, or team truck got stopped, got searched. They found this white powder. I assumed it was just a mistake, that they thought it was something else, but no, actually they were confiscating the creatine and let us go with a strict warning. And hadn't really heard much since, but it's well and truly back in the spotlight now. And a lot of promise touted around its potential. Often referred to as a miracle supplement that we should all be taking. Some of the loading doses that I previously heard of are now being recommended as continuous daily doses. And so are you feeling the same, that there is this renewed hype about creatine?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're talking about websites and magazines before, but certainly social media is probably ground zero for that at the moment in terms of where a lot of that talk is coming from, certainly from what I'm picking up. And you're right, it's different now. It's very much along the lines of everyone should be taking this. If you're not taking this, you're missing out. Big doses. It seems to be creatine and electrolytes. They're the two big ones at the moment that are getting really pushed a lot, I think, for almost everyone in every situation.
And electrolytes, funny enough, being, I think, the first episode that you and I recorded together on Performance Process. Perhaps we should start with just, for the listeners who might only associate creatine with, gyms and bodybuilding. Can you give us a sort of 1 minute science primer for what is creatine and what does it do in the body?
Yeah, sure. So creatine is a compound that's naturally occurring in the body, and I think that's an important first point. It is made from 3 different amino acids, so glycine, arginine, and methionine, and we actually produce some creatine naturally in our bodies. We actually make creatine in our body, in our liver and our kidneys. And the majority of that creatine, about 90% of it, is actually stored in our muscles, and we'll get to why and why it's important shortly. Bearing in mind also that muscle tissue includes the heart itself, being your muscle tissue. The remaining 10% of the creatine naturally occurring in our body is found mostly in the brain. There's tiny amounts in a couple of other organs, but the majority of the remaining creatine is in the brain. So majority in muscle, some in brain, and I guess when you think about the claims that are emerging around creatine, they're really related to those 2 organs, which makes the most sense.
And can you tell me, why did it, I think it is statistically the most researched supplement in sports nutrition, but why did it get pigeonholed so strongly as a strength or a bodybuilding supplement?
Well, I guess it's because of the way it works and the way it was, I guess, kind of discovered. To go back in time, I guess the emergence of creatine as a supplement in humans sort of kicked off in the wake of the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona. And it sort of emerged following those Olympics that a few British athletes had been using it, sort of track sprinters and that sort of thing. Linford Christie, I think, was one famous example, some of the hurdlers and so on as well. But interestingly, creatine as a supplement, that sort of initial research was done by a British researcher, Roger Harris, who recently passed away, actually, I think only a year or two ago. But he started that work in the late 80s in the horse racing industry, of all places. And it was very quickly told he was not welcome and supplements were not welcome in the horse racing industry, which I think is very different today to what it was back in the 80s. But then he picked up that research and moved it from horses to humans, essentially. And that's where it sort of came along. And so I think 1992 was the first publication that came out showing that creatine supplements could increase the amount of creatine that you stored in your muscles compared to not supplementing. And so the other thing I forgot to mention before is as well as producing creatine and then obviously the supplements that we're talking about today, you actually do get some creatine from food as well. So obviously, because most of the creatine is stored in the muscle, not surprisingly, creatine from food is going to come from eating the muscle of other animals. So meat, fish, and chicken are going to be sources of creatine in our diet, whereas plant-based foods, there's virtually no creatine in them at all. So vegetarian and vegan diets will be almost completely devoid of creatine, whereas we will get some in food if you eat meat, fish, and chicken.
And is that being devoid of creatine an issue? Like, we're talking about supplementing additional creatine here. If you're deficient in creatine, how much of an issue is that?
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily a complete deficiency in creatine. It's not like a nutrient in that pure sort of sense of the word. It's just to say that you're getting less in, so your body stores are probably less maximized than they would be if you were eating those foods. Obviously, we're still making that creatine in the liver and the kidneys from amino acids, and they can come from plant foods. But what we do see is that people on vegetarian or vegan diets probably see a bigger bump up in their creatine stores compared to people are eating meat, fish, and chicken because they already have a little bit of that increased creatine storage just because of the dietary sources of the creatine.
So what then is it that we use those creatine stores for?
Yeah, so I guess the original one, and coming back to your question before about, how did this all kind of come about as a supplement? We produce energy in different ways in our muscles, and this is where I guess that research sort of started from. So just to give you a quick bit of background, the way we produce energy in all the cells of our body, and our muscles are no exception, is by taking a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and the tri meaning three, so it's got three phosphates, and removing one of the phosphates. And it's the removal of that phosphate, turning the ATP into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, that releases energy for our cells to use. So the question is then, how do we get ATP? So there's a little bit of ATP that just sort of sits around in our cells all the time. Our ATP levels can't drop to zero because the cell would die. So there's always a tiny little bit of ATP just floating around, ready to be basically instantaneously turned into energy. But if we were suddenly to do, lift some weights or get on a bike and do a really hard effort or something, that amount of resting ATP would be used up within a fraction of a second. That's literally how little there is. So we have to produce this ATP constantly. And so we tend to think about that ATP production being from carbohydrate and fat during exercise using oxygen, and that's what we call oxidative phosphorylation. So basically phosphorylation, adding phosphate to something. So it's taking ADP and adding that last phosphate to it to form ATP, oxidative because it requires oxygen to do that. And so that's often one way of making ATP. The other way of doing it is using what's called the phosphocreatine system. So we have this creatine binds to phosphate to form creatine phosphate in the muscles, and that can also release that phosphate to give it to the ADP to produce ATP. That process is much faster than producing ATP via carbohydrate or fat. So it provides a much faster source of ATP for the muscle. And that's why it's used in very high intensity exercise, because it can produce that ATP to release energy much more quickly than it then the body can, going through the whole process of turning fat or carbohydrate into ATP, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where that kind of gets to my thinking 15 years ago when I first tried it. And I haven't been using it for 15 years. I tried it 15 years ago and tried it again this year, and I don't recall really using it in between. But my thinking was, okay, it's only really useful for strength athletes. Maybe that makes sense for sprints than that. There was no scientific evidence to say it's going to work for endurance, which is the type of athlete I was. But it is it is an energy system. And so topping it up with a supplement might well make sense. And I remember specifically taking it one year for the Ross, which is an Irish stage race. And it's known, because there's only 5 rider teams, it's known for being full gas, start to finish, repeated efforts over and over again. And in my head, I started to reason that, well, it would make sense for that type of race where we're not climbing big mountains. The weight gain isn't going to be an issue, but I might be able to do repeated efforts. Was I getting that entirely wrong, or is that a simplification, but a fairly accurate simplification?
Yes and no. So producing that ATP from phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate, depending on which way you want to say it, that produces ATP very quickly. But that store of phosphocreatine, even after taking creatine supplements, which will boost that level up, that only lasts a very short period of time. So it produces ATP very quickly, but it's only going to last maybe 10 to 20 seconds, something like that, and it's going to decline, and then you're reliant on those other kind of energy sources. So there might be, one-off really hard efforts, sort of things you can think of as an example might be for the sprinters on the track, that start when they've got to push, an enormous gear from a standing start, that real hard effort just to get the whole thing turning. That would be an example where you're probably going to be using phosphocreatine, but also sprint type efforts. And, we don't always sometimes I think people kind of simplify things a little bit and say, oh, this sort of effort uses only like fat to produce ATP or carbohydrate to produce ATP or phosphocreatine to produce ATP. The reality is there's always a mixture of these going on. It's just what that mixture kind of looks like. And probably the other one we didn't add into there is actually the breakdown of carbohydrate from glucose. That first part called glycolysis, which can happen in the absence of oxygen, that will also produce some ATP more quickly than the oxygen part in the mitochondria, but not as quick as phosphocreatine. So that's another source of energy in those sort of anaerobic type efforts. So it's sort of a combination of all these different things going on. And I think the question that we're trying to get to and that has been looked at from a research point of view over the years is, where is that kind of crossover? Like, how hard does the effort need to be for creatine supplementation to actually make a meaningful difference to performance, and over sort of what duration type effort before the effect of creatine kind of washes out.
Mm-hmm. And that like the mixture that you're referring to there, it's kind of, I think that's often a case of mistaking relative values with absolute values. And so it's like, yeah, you've always got a contribution from every, I don't know if I'm accurate in saying that, but I'll say it anyway. You've always got a contribution from every system. It's just the intensity will dictate, which one is contributing the most. But with higher intensity, you're still going to be, you may burn relatively more fat at lower intensity, but higher intensity, you're going to be burning more absolute fat. Anyway, I'm waffling now. I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And there's a couple of different factors that probably are relevant to why that's the case. One is obviously, again, the amount of energy that's required or the speed that we need to produce that ATP will dictate kind of which systems need to produce that, because each system has its kind of ceiling in terms of how fast it can actually make ATP. And then the other factor is obviously the presence of oxygen. So, VO2 max is therefore going to have a limiting element to how much oxygen we can bring in to help with part of that process in terms of the oxidative phosphorylation aspect of that as well. So that all kind of comes into the mix. I guess with phosphocreatine as well, like once it's given up that phosphate to produce ATP from ADP, it can reform back into creatine phosphate, because obviously once it gives up that phosphate to the ATP breaks back down to ADP and then releases the phosphate again, and that's what releases the energy. But the process of resynthesizing creatine phosphate, so joining the phosphate back to the creatine so it can be used again, that has to require more ATP. So basically, what that means is it's only going to reform once you start resting or backing off the intensity to the point where you're producing enough ATP through fat and carbohydrate oxidation to then use that ATP to restore the phosphocreatine so it can be all used again. And that process involves the creatine going into the mitochondria, collecting the phosphate and bringing it back out again. And there's some other aspects of that that are thought for some of the more recent, I guess, claims around creatine supplementation, that actually some of the effects may be like an antioxidant type effect or an anti-inflammatory type effect of creatine in the muscle. And it's this sort of shuttling in and out of the mitochondria that plays a role in all of this. And I guess the supplementation is trying to boost up those phosphocreatine stores so you've got more to begin with, but also there's more then available to kind of recycle and use again. And so some of the research sort of looks at either one-off sort of sprint efforts, but sometimes also repeated sprint efforts with short rest periods as well.
And interestingly now, just as you're saying that, I'm thinking back to some of the research now is actually looking at sort of over-under intensity intervals where you're just above, say, FTP or threshold or whatever mark you want to use, and then dropping to a lower intensity. And I think some of those are, I'm just seeing some studies of late that are looking at that in terms of creatine's effectiveness. And
yeah,
would make sense.
Yeah. So there's a few studies like that, a few that have sort of interspersed sprints sort of above VO2 max amongst sort of a bigger body of work, I suppose, in terms of exercise. A few that have sort of combined different types of efforts and then tried to measure the performance of all the different ones. So had sort of a longer time trial, and then within that had some shorter sprint efforts, either 1 kilometer or 4 kilometers, for example, and then had like a time to exhaustion at the end, which is kind of just hit a high intensity and hold on for dear life until you can't anymore kind of thing, which I guess is analogous to like a hill climb for a lot of domestiques in particular. It's just hold on till you can't anymore. It just depends on the intensity of how long you can hold on for. Like, what is it trying to simulate?
Can we look at creatine as, if I'm hearing you correctly here, like a fuel source? And so the same way we would carb load before a big event, is there an argument that loading, that is why we do the creatine load, or is that oversimplifying it?
Yeah, no, essentially yes. I guess the difference is how much you can store and how long it's going to be useful for. So obviously with your carbohydrate loading and those glycogen stores, you're going to last well over an hour, possibly 2 at sort of hard efforts, or longer if it's a sort of a prolonged, less intense effort. Whereas with creatine, we're talking about depleting those creatine, or, donating all of its phosphates to the ADP to form ATP, within sort of 5 to 15 seconds, and it's depleted. It will regenerate from ATP, but it's going to take some time, a few minutes potentially. But I guess what we're looking at with this sort of creatine supplementation is maybe that eking out that 5 to seconds to 10 or 15 seconds, which doesn't sound like much, but in the context of maximal efforts like a sprint, like lifting some weight in the gym, all of those kind of efforts are going to be ones where a difference of a few seconds that you can maintain that maximal effort is going to be significant potentially from a performance point of view, either in terms of its benefit from a training perspective or obviously competition.
And if we're talking about competition, can it, and again, like we're maybe going down a different rabbit hole here, we'll just peek down it for a second and we'll come back out again, but like, if we're thinking about having a source of creatine there for a sprint that maybe at the end of a 5-hour race or something, will it still be there if we load in the days prior to a race when we get to the end of that 5 hours?
Yeah, it's a good question. Theoretically, yes, because the creatine phosphate is stored in the muscle, and then if we use some up during the event, there's a few surges, or you get forming a breakaway or whatever it is, you might use some up, but then it's regenerated again once the intensity backs off. So as long as the intensity is kind of backed off, then it will theoretically regenerate. And that's what we generally see in the research as well, is often it's not necessarily the first hard effort that is improved with creatine. It's actually doing repeated efforts, it's the later ones that seem to be getting the most benefit from creatine supplementation rather than necessarily the first couple.
I mean, rightly or wrongly, in my head, that makes sense. We've got a small amount of creatine in our systems normally. We've added to it. Yeah, I'm going to put two and two together there and get whatever I get. Let's assume if an athlete or a rider is perfectly well hydrated, is there still space in the muscle to retain more water, or is the weight gain something that is maybe only found by someone who maybe could benefit from that weight gain anyway because they are underhydrated or they're not carrying enough glycogen into race day?
No, there's always room for more. Obviously, the extreme of that is overhydration and becoming fluid overloaded. Now, we obviously don't want to get to that stage, and creatine alone is not going to do that. You're just not going to be able to store enough creatine in the cell to pull that much water in. But yeah, so what will happen is that the water will be drawn into the cells because that's where the creatine goes. And that will mean that there's less water on the outside of the cells, which will kind of trigger a response to retain more water from, because it's the blood circulating around to the brain through the kidneys that kind of regulates the water ins and outs from the body. And so, yes, you will start to retain more water on the outside of the cells because you've pulled some into the inside of the cells.
All that then, I mean, getting back to the current hype, I mean, some of the recommendations that we're hearing now, and yes, I neglected to mention social media earlier. How could I forget? But some recommendations are looking at like 20 gram per day doses on a continual basis, which was previously what I understood to be just like the first 3 or 5 day loading period. Do you know where that trend is coming from? Is there any backing for that in everything you've just explained?
To get to that, maybe I'll explain what the traditional dosing has been recommended. So essentially, there's a couple of different ways that you can take creatine supplementation. I guess if you want to maximize those creatine stores in the muscle in particular, because I guess that's where the original research came from, as quickly as possible, then you're looking at taking about 20 grams of creatine monohydrate or equivalent per day for about a week. And that will kind of maximize those stores. But once they're maximized, you only need about 5 grams a day, which is about like a teaspoon of powder if you've got it in pure form, to maintain that level for as long as you keep taking it, essentially. Now, when you're taking the 20 grams a day, you do need to break it into smaller doses because it will cause some gastrointestinal issues if you try to take the whole 20 grams at once. Probably the easiest way to describe it is it has an osmotic effect. So it's very similar to trying to take a big whack of sodium bicarb, for example. So for people who maybe have experimented around with that and experienced or know people that have experienced the GI side effects of that, it's a similar kind of experience here if you take too much creatine in one go. In terms of why that sort of maintaining the 20 grams a day has come into play, I think from what I've read, part of it may be hype, but I think part of it is also the growth in interest around the effects of creatine in the brain. So those original sort of loading and then maintenance doses were really designed to maximize and then maintain the maximal storage of creatine within the muscle. But as I said before, about 10-ish% of the creatine in our body it's actually in our brain. And that's an area of, I guess, renewed interest. And, we'll get into, some of the claims and where the research is at on that shortly. But I think the higher dose is meant to be, okay, well, we actually need that higher dose to maintain the brain, to maximize the brain creatine levels as well as the muscle creatine levels.
Is that, maybe it's a stupid question, but is that 10% stored in the brain? Like if we increase the amount of creatine in our body, does our brain naturally maintain that 10% balance, or is it kind of, that was just what they found in the
I'm not
original?
100% sure, and obviously it's a lot harder to measure brain creatine stores than it is a muscle, because you can biopsy a muscle. You don't want to really biopsy someone's brain. There are techniques to try and figure that out, and there is some animal studies that have looked at that as well, but yeah, it is an area that I think also because of the blood-brain barrier, it takes a lot more creatine to actually get enough across and into the brain to have an effect from what I've seen, having a read about it recently. But I think there's very few studies looking at like what is the optimal dosing to maintain, maximal brain creatine content. So it's based on very little research at the moment. So there is some research there, but not a lot. And so I think over time we may look back at it and go, well, actually, maybe we did need more than 5 grams, but it was only 10 or something like that. Forgot as well, the other area or the other reason why people may go for a higher dose than just the 5 grams a day for maintenance is actually for really big athletes. So when I say big athletes, I'm talking about like your bodybuilders, your strongman athletes, people who have massive amounts of muscle mass. Because if we think about it, most of the things when we talk about like carbohydrate, we talk about it in grams per kilo of body weight, but we don't tend to do that with creatine. But of course, it makes sense. If you've got more muscle, you've probably got more capacity to store creatine because there's more muscle tissue. And so, the higher doses may also be just for really big guys. So, your rowers, your rugby players, that kind of thing. But that's probably not where we're thinking at here in terms of cyclists, because we're generally not the 7-foot guys with the enormous muscle mass.
We could have big-brained cyclists.
True. Very true.
I think from what you're saying there's not much, if any, scientific research, let alone evidence, into these mega doses. There is so much and stacks of research on the old 5 gram approach, and so sort of time will tell as we do explore it more. But I think the one thing we can be fairly certain of, probably up until a certain level, but there's no real risks associated with having too much creatine, is there?
Yeah, correct. So creatine, as I said, has been around since probably the early 1990s as a supplement. As you mentioned off the top, it is one of the most studied supplements, apart from possibly caffeine. And there has been quite a lot of studies around, I guess, sort of long-term use, high doses, etc., and looking at the safety profile of that. And generally speaking, it's regarded as pretty safe. There's not really major concerns there. One concern that does come up from time to time, and inevitably there'll be someone listening to this that has this concern, is when you turn over creatine within the muscle, you bind it to phosphate, then it releases the phosphate, then it goes and collects it again once ATP's been restored. About 1% to 2% of the creatine per day will degrade into what we call creatinine, which is kind of like the waste product from creatine. Obviously, if it didn't degrade, you would never need to supplement because you would always have maximal stores. But it degrades at about 1% to 2% of the total body creatine per day. And that then gets flushed out through the kidneys and in our urine. Now, traditionally, when we look at trying to measure, this is more from a general health point of view, kidney function, one of the main markers of kidney function that doctors use is a blood creatinine level. And that's because if you have signs of kidney failure, what will happen is the kidneys won't be able to flush out all that creatinine and it'll build up in the blood and you'll have an elevated level within the blood. And so doctors will use that, and there's actually equations that they can use to try and estimate your kidney function based on the blood creatinine level. Now, the problem with creatine supplementation is now you're creating a higher creatine store, higher creatine turnover, and therefore higher creatinine production in the body compared to if you weren't supplementing. And so there's going to be more creatinine floating around in the blood. And it's not because the kidneys are failing that it's backing up. It's just that you're producing more of it than normal. And so often you'll see general practitioners that aren't aware of kind of creatine supplements and this whole turnover of creatinine and creatine that will get a creatinine result of someone who's taking creatine supplements, particularly the higher doses, and freak out and think that their kidneys are failing, when in fact their kidneys are probably perfectly healthy. It's just that they've got a higher level for the kidneys to filter because they're turning over more each day.
Is there, I presume there is some risk there that actually supplementing with creatine could maybe hide an issue that would otherwise be found in a blood test or something like that?
Yeah, it's technically possible. Yeah.
So, I mean, just if you are visiting your GP and you're looking at those sorts of things, maybe just inform them that you are taking creatine if you are.
Yes, and if you stop taking creatine, it takes about 4 weeks for the levels to kind of return to what they would have been pre-supplementation. So if you are going to do a blood test to look at this and you're in a situation where it may be important to know that accurately, you may want to stop the creatine supplementation a few weeks before doing that blood test if you want to be absolutely sure.
The other, I'll go with side effect, I'm desperately trying to find a different word, but is weight gain associated with creatine supplement? Can you tell us what happens there, why we do associate creatine with a weight gain?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, with the GI issues, creatine is what we call osmotically active, so it's going to attract water, and that's what causes the potential GI issues if you take a big dose in one hit, just like it does with sodium bicarbonate, draws water into the gut and then causes those kind of GI problems. But once creatine is absorbed into the body, works its way into the muscle cells, obviously a little bit into the brain, but mostly into the muscle cells. It is going to act as an osmotically active agent within the muscle as well. So it's going to draw water into the muscle to balance out the osmolality, just like a large dose of salt or sodium is going to do the opposite. So on the outside of the cells, it will have a similar effect. The amount of weight gain probably depends on the person. Studies have reported anything from about half a kilo up to about 1.5 kilos, but probably more in the half a kilo to 1 kilo mark is probably more common, I would say. And you get this, or you notice this weight gain over that sort of first week when you're doing that loading from the start to the end of that week. You can sort of see that difference. And there have been studies, I guess more so in running, because it's a weight bearing sport where you've got to move that body weight across the ground, trying to look at whether that's detrimental or not from a performance point of view. So yes, you might get the benefit from the creatine, but is it offset by the weight gain? And generally, most of those studies, certainly for sprint efforts, have found that the benefit from the creatine has more than offset the detrimental or potential detrimental effect of the weight gain. And that's been looked at in team sports and things like that. Obviously, for people in the gym, it doesn't matter, that sort of weight gain. I guess from a cycling point of view, there's probably a couple of parts to this, and I think it's an interesting discussion that is broader than just creatine, because we talk about sort of hyperhydration strategies, deliberately trying to overhydrate before kind of hard efforts in really hot environments where we're going to be sweating a lot, where maybe it's not going to be possible to drink enough to maintain kind of optimal hydration during those events as an advantage. And yet we talk about this weight gain as it's a disadvantage, but in fact it's water gain in exactly the same way as if you were using glycerol or sodium loading or something like that. It's only where that water sits that is slightly different between those three. So sodium, the water sits outside the cells, so in the blood and the fluid surrounding the cells. Creatine, it sits on the inside of the cells, and glycerol, it's sort of evenly distributed between the two. The final thing I'd say on this is there is some suggestion now from some of the researchers in creatine that weight gain may be transient as well. In other words, that first week or two when you first start supplementing creatine, you gain that weight and you sort of hold that higher weight for a while, but it probably tends to drop off. So other osmotic agents or molecules within the cells kind of balance each other out, and then the water level kind of returns to what it was before you supplemented after a few weeks of taking creatine as well. I don't think there's any really good research to clearly show this sort of gain and then return to normal, but it is certainly suggested that effect is kind of a transient effect over that first week or two of supplementation.
Yeah, you've took us where I was hoping to go there, and one of the reasons I was hesitant to use the word side effect in terms of the weight gain was that I've often wondered, and it was part of my original thinking, was like, yes, I'm going to retain water, gain weight, but if I'm going to be dehydrated within an hour or two of exercise in a very hot environment anyway, potentially that's a good thing. And then secondly, is there any chance that water retention would actually help with, say, carb loading also?
Yeah, well, that's the other interesting area in terms of some of the, I guess, the non-ATP effects of creatine. And one of those, there is some evidence that supplementing with creatine alongside carbohydrate may actually improve glycogen storage as well. And so that has been one way kind of proposed, at least theoretically, of why creatine may be useful for endurance athletes. One is actually, we talk about the weight, but is actually the water gain helpful? But the second one is the glycogen storage. So, there's been some talk around that in research papers or reviews of creatine in endurance athletes recently that might be potentially a benefit as well.
Let's assume if an athlete or a rider is perfectly well hydrated, is there still space in the muscle to retain more water, or is the weight gain something that is maybe only found by someone who maybe could benefit from that weight gain anyway because they are underhydrated or they're not carrying enough glycogen into race day?
No, there's always room for more. Obviously, the extreme of that is overhydration and becoming fluid overloaded. Now, we obviously don't want to get to that stage, and creatine alone is not going to do that. You're just not going to be able to store enough creatine in the cell to pull that much water in. But yeah, so what will happen is that the water will be drawn into the cells because that's where the creatine goes. And that will mean that there's less water on the outside of the cells, which will kind of trigger a response to retain more water from, because it's the blood circulating around to the brain through the kidneys that kind of regulates the water ins and outs from the body. And so, yes, you will start to retain more water on the outside of the cells because you pulled some into the inside of the cells.
Okay, folks, that's where we're cutting off the free version of this podcast this week. Just a reminder, if you head over to escapecollective.com/member, you can sign up now and you can get the entire podcast uninterrupted. You'll not have me butting in to cut you off or to remind you that you're not yet a member. And in doing so, you will be helping to ensure this podcast continues for many more episodes and months and years to come. So head over escapecollective.com/member now to sign up to Escape Collective and to get the entire episode of Performance Process along with all of the other podcasts and written content that we publish on our website.